The uncle's hand was shaking so badly that wine sloshed over the rim of his glass and onto the white tablecloth. And nobody at that table understood why two simple words had just turned a successful, confident man into someone who looked like he'd seen a ghost sit down right next to him. Before I tell you what happened at that family dinner, you need to know 3 things are going to happen in this story. And I promise you none of them are what you expect. First, you're going to find out exactly why a grown man old enough to be my father went pale and started apologizing before I'd even finished my sentence. Second, you're going to learn what really happened during the deployment that earned me that nickname. Because the official story and the real story are not the same thing. Not even close. And third, by the end of this video, you're going to understand why my sister-in-law's husband, the man who'd been needling me all night with that smug little smile, suddenly couldn't look me in the eye for the rest of the evening. Stick around, because the answer to all 3 of these questions is buried in a night that started as a boring obligation and ended with a stranger learning more about who I really am than my own in-laws had managed to figure out in 3 years of holidays. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I'm the woman who married into a family that never quite knew what to do with me. I joined the service right out of high school, did the kind of work that doesn't get talked about at dinner parties, and came home eventually to a quiet life that nobody around that table had ever bothered asking real questions about. They knew I'd served. They knew I'd been overseas more than once. Beyond that, to them, I was just the wife who didn't talk much about her job. The one who smiled politely when conversations turned to things like stock portfolios and vacation homes, and which private school was better for the kids. That particular evening was my sister-in-law's anniversary dinner, hosted in a restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list nobody at our end of the table could actually afford on their own, paid for by the groom's side of the family, because that's simply how things worked in that world. The room was full of people who'd known each other for decades, who'd gone to the same country club, who measured each other in subtle, constant ways that I'd learned to recognize but never participate in. I sat near the end of the table, between my husband and an empty chair that would later matter more than I could have guessed, listening to small talk drift past me like weather. My sister-in-law had married into a family with old money and older habits. The kind of family where conversations about charity galas slid seamlessly into conversations about which contractor had handled whose kitchen renovation. Where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business in a way that felt less like intimacy and more like surveillance dressed up as warmth. I'd attended enough of these dinners by then to know the unspoken rules, who deferred to whom, which jokes were safe and which carried quiet barbs, how long you were expected to stay before slipping away felt acceptable rather than rude. I'd learned to navigate it the way you learn to navigate any unfamiliar terrain, carefully, quietly, without drawing unnecessary attention. The groom's uncle, the man who would upend the entire evening within the hour, had been pointed out to me earlier by my sister-in-law in passing. A brief introduction over the cheese course. The kind of introduction that comes with 3 seconds of context and then moves on to the next person in the room. He runs some kind of consulting business now, she'd said, waving a hand vaguely. Used to be in the service decades ago, doesn't talk about it much. I remember nodding politely, the way you nod at 100 small facts about 100 extended family members you'll likely never think about again, filing it away without any sense of how significant that throwaway detail was about to become. He'd seemed, for most of the dinner, exactly as forgettable as that introduction suggested. A quiet man in his 60s nursing a single glass of wine, contributing the occasional dry comment to conversations about real estate and college admissions. Never quite at the center of anything, never quite at the edges either. If you'd asked me, an hour before everything changed, to describe him, I'd have struggled to come up with much beyond pleasant and unremarkable, which in hindsight feels like exactly the kind of camouflage some people learn to wear permanently, long after the reasons for wearing it have faded into the past. My brother-in-law had never liked me. Not really, not in any dramatic way. Just in the quiet way some people decide early that you don't belong somewhere, and never bother revising that opinion. He worked in finance. The kind of finance that involves a lot of golf and a lot of opinions about people who chose different paths than his. All night he'd been making little comments, little jokes with edges on them, the kind designed to land soft enough that nobody could call him out, but sharp enough that I felt every one of them. He'd ask about my job in a tone that made the question sound like an accusation. He'd glance at my husband like he was waiting for permission to say something worse. It hadn't always been this pointed. In the early years of my marriage, he mostly ignored me, the way people ignore something they've decided doesn't merit their attention, a polite nod across the table and nothing more. It was only as his own career had stalled in small, frustrating ways, missed promotions, a bonus that didn't materialize the way he'd been promised, that the comments toward me had sharpened, as if proving himself superior to someone he assumed was beneath him might patch over the cracks forming somewhere else in his life. I'd noticed the pattern long before that night. People who feel unsteady in their own story often need someone else's story to feel smaller than theirs. My husband had warned me, gently, on the drive over, that his brother had been in one of those moods lately, the kind where he picked fights at dinners just to feel like he'd won something by the end of the night. I'd told him it didn't matter, that I'd sat through worse than dinner table jabs, and I meant it, though I don't think he fully understood yet just how literally true that was. We'd been married 3 years, and in all that time I'd given him the broad strokes of my service, the kind of summary that satisfies polite curiosity without inviting follow-up questions. And he'd never pushed for more, partly out of respect and partly, I think, because some quiet part of him sensed there were rooms in my past he wasn't meant to walk through uninvited. The restaurant itself had been chosen by my sister-in-law months in advance, the kind of place where the waitstaff refilled water glasses before they were half empty, and the menu listed prices only on the host's copy. Candles flickered along the center of the table, throwing soft light against crystal that probably cost more than my first car. I remember thinking, somewhere around the appetizers, how strange it was to sit in a room built entirely around comfort and performance, surrounded by people who'd never had to learn what either of those words actually cost. It was somewhere around the second course, plates of food nobody had really wanted clearing away, when he finally leaned across the table with that smile he always wore right before he said something he thought was clever. The whole table quieted slightly, the way rooms do when someone signals they're about to perform. He looked at me, swirling wine he hadn't earned the taste for, and asked the question that started everything. "So, you're in the Navy. What's your nickname?" He said it like a joke, like he already knew there couldn't possibly be a real answer, like he was setting up something for the table to laugh at. I felt my husband tense slightly beside me. I felt the weight of a dozen eyes shifting toward our end of the table, curious in that idle way people get when they sense a small drama unfolding over expensive food. I answered him plainly, without any drama in my voice, because there was nothing dramatic about the truth. "Mad Dog," I said. For a moment, nothing happened. My brother-in-law actually started to laugh, opening his mouth to make whatever joke he'd prepared. The kind of joke that assumes a nickname like that must be ironic, must be a story about losing at cards or snoring too loud during training. But the laugh died somewhere in his throat, because something had shifted at the other end of the table, something nobody had been paying attention to until that exact second. The groom's uncle, a man who had barely spoken all evening, who I'd been told ran some kind of consulting business and was generally considered the quiet, harmless relative everyone tolerated at these things, had gone completely still. His wine glass was frozen halfway to his mouth. His face had drained of color so fast it looked almost theatrical, except nothing about his expression was performing anything. He looked, for lack of a better word, afraid. And then he set his glass down, hard enough that the sound cut through the low murmur of conversation, and he turned to my brother-in-law with an intensity that didn't match anything that had happened at that table all night. "Apologize," he said. "Now. The first open loop sitting in front of you right now is obvious, and I want you to hold on to it, because we are not answering it yet." Why would a quiet uncle nobody really knew, a man who'd shown zero interest in military matters all evening, suddenly recognize a nickname that meant absolutely nothing to anyone else in that room? The second loop is this: what actually happened during my service that earned me a name like that? Because the truth behind it is not the story you're picturing, and it connects to something far bigger than one deployment. And the third loop, the one that's going to keep tightening as this story goes on, is what the uncle knew, specifically, that made him react like a man who'd just watched a ghost walk through the door wearing his old uniform. Keep all 3 of these in your mind, because by the end of this video, every single one gets answered, in full, with nothing held back. The table had gone silent in that particular way rooms go silent when something real cuts through something performative. My brother-in-law, to his credit, looked genuinely confused, glancing between his uncle and me like he was trying to find the joke he thought he'd been part of seconds earlier. My sister-in-law's face had shifted from polite hostess mode into something more alert, more careful, the look of someone recalculating a dinner she thought she had under control. I didn't say anything right away. In my line of work, you learn that silence is rarely empty. It's almost always doing something. And in that moment, I wanted to see what the uncle would do next before I filled the space myself. He was still looking at my brother-in-law, waiting, his jaw tight, his hand no longer shaking but gripping the edge of the table like he needed something solid to hold on to. For now, why don't you make sure you're subscribed and drop a like on this video? Because what's coming next, the real reason that name carries the weight it does, is going to surprise you in ways you are not expecting from a story that started as a quiet family dinner. This is the kind of story that gets better the deeper it goes. And I promise the next 20 minutes are going to earn every second of your attention. My brother-in-law mumbled something, an apology of sorts, though it came out more confused than sincere. The apology of a man who doesn't understand what he's apologizing for, but recognizes he's supposed to say the words anyway. The uncle didn't acknowledge it much, just gave a short nod, like the apology itself wasn't really the point, like something else was happening underneath the surface that none of us could see yet. My husband reached for my hand under the table, and I remember thinking, not for the first time, that he understood more about what that name meant than anyone else in that room, and that he was waiting, the same way the uncle seemed to be waiting, to see how much of the truth I was willing to let surface in front of people who'd spent years not really asking. The uncle finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost private, though everyone at the table was straining to hear it. He asked me a question that none of them understood the weight of. He asked what unit I'd served with, what years, where. Simple questions on the surface, the kind any curious person might ask. Except his eyes never left mine while he asked them, and there was something underneath the question that felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation, like a man checking facts against a memory he'd been carrying for a very long time. I gave him partial answers, the kind I'd given 100 times before to people who didn't have clearance to hear the rest, vague enough to be true without being complete. But something about the way he nodded after each answer told me he already knew more than he was letting on. That he was filling in blanks I hadn't given him, that this wasn't the first time he'd heard a story that rhymed with mine. If you've made it this far into the video, you're exactly the kind of person who finishes what they start, the kind of person who doesn't click away from something the moment it gets interesting. And that matters here, because the next part of this story rewards patience in a way most stories don't. You've already invested the time to get here. You're already curious enough to wonder how a quiet uncle and a deployment nickname connect to something much larger. And people who stick with stories like this one, all the way to the parts that actually pay off, tend to be the same people who end up subscribing to channels that keep telling them stories worth staying for. So, if that sounds like you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because we are just getting to the part where everything starts connecting. The rest of the table had started to find their footing again, conversations resuming in low, careful tones. The way people talk after witnessing something they don't fully understand, but know better than to comment on directly. My sister-in-law tried, gamely, to steer things back toward neutral territory, asking about dessert, about the band that would be playing later, anything to paper over the strange crack that had just opened in her perfectly planned evening. But the uncle wasn't finished. He asked if he could speak with me privately for a few minutes, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the restaurant near the bar, away from the table, away from the eyes that were still pretending not to watch us. I looked at my husband, who gave the smallest nod, the kind that said, "Go, I'll be here," and I followed the uncle across the room, leaving behind a table full of people who had no idea they were about to wait 20 minutes for an explanation that would rearrange everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who never talked about her work. We stood near the end of the bar, away from the noise, and the first thing the uncle did was apologize again. this time for his nephew, and then for himself, for reacting the way he had in front of everyone. I told him it was fine, though I was still working out exactly what had just happened, still piecing together why a stranger's face had drained of color over a nickname most people would have laughed off as something out of a movie. He told me he'd served too, decades earlier, in a different branch, a different war, the kind of service nobody at these dinners ever brought up because it didn't fit the narrative the family preferred to tell about itself. He told me he'd known men, and one woman in particular, who'd carried that same nickname, earned in circumstances he refused to describe in detail even now, all these years later, standing in a restaurant that smelled like candle wax and expensive perfume, instead of whatever place that memory actually belonged to. He talked for a while before he got to the point, the way people sometimes do when they're circling something too heavy to walk straight at. He told me about the years after his own service, how he'd come home to a family that treated his time away like an inconvenient gap on a resume, rather than something that had reshaped him at a cellular level. He told me he'd spent most family functions for the better part of 2 decades doing exactly what I'd been doing all evening, smiling, nodding, letting people believe the version of him that fit neatly into golf course conversation. Nobody at these dinners had ever asked him a real question either. Not until tonight. Not until a stranger's nickname cracked something open he thought he'd sealed shut for good. He admitted, almost sheepishly, that he'd built an entire persona around being the harmless, slightly boring relative, the uncle nobody had to think too hard about, because it was easier than constantly managing other people's discomfort with what he'd actually done and seen. It had worked for years, that careful performance of unremarkable. It had taken exactly one word, spoken across a dinner table by someone who had no idea what it would unlock, to crack the whole thing open in front of a room full of people who'd never suspected there was anything underneath it at all. I watched him while he spoke and recognized something in the careful way he chose his words, the long pauses before certain sentences, the way his eyes drifted toward the middle distance whenever he got close to specifics he wasn't going to share. It's a particular kind of fluency, learned only by people who've had to explain just enough of something terrible to satisfy a question without ever actually opening the door behind it. I'd used that same fluency on my own family more times than I could count. He asked if he could ask me something more personal, and when I told him to go ahead, he asked whether I still thought about it, whatever it was, whatever specific night had earned me that name. I told him the truth, that some nights it was distant, almost like a story that had happened to someone else, and other nights it sat right behind my ribs as if no time had passed at all. He nodded slowly, like that answer matched something he already knew from the inside, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, just stood there in a noisy restaurant carrying 2 private, parallel silences that had somehow found each other across a dinner table full of strangers. He asked me again, more directly this time, where I'd served, and something in his voice told me he already suspected the answer before I gave it. And when I told him, fully this time, no vague edges, no professional softening, I watched something settle into his face that was part recognition and part something heavier, something closer to grief. It turned out the nickname Mad Dog wasn't something assigned randomly, wasn't a joke about temper or attitude the way most people assumed when they heard it. It had a history, a specific and very narrow history, tied to a handful of operations that very few people outside a tight circle ever learned the real details of. Operations where the name had been used as both an identifier and, eventually, as something closer to a warning passed quietly between people who needed to know who they were dealing with. The uncle had crossed paths with someone who carried that name long before I ever did, in a different decade, a different operation, under circumstances that had nearly cost him his life and had cost others theirs. He told me, voice low, that he'd assumed for years the name had died with the person who first earned it, that hearing it again, spoken so casually across a dinner table by a young woman married into his family, had felt for one disorienting second like the past reaching directly into the present and tapping him on the shoulder. This is where the real story starts to take shape, and I want you to stay with me here. because the next part explains something that's been sitting underneath this entire video without you even realizing it. The nickname wasn't given to me for something small. It wasn't a joke about my attitude in basic training or a nod to some harmless quirk. It came from an incident during my service that very few people, even people close to me, have ever heard the full version of. And it's an incident that connects, in ways neither the uncle nor I expected that night, to something happening right now in the present that nobody at that dinner table could have imagined. Let me take you back to where it actually started, because to understand why that name carries the weight it does, you need to understand the situation I was in when I earned it. I was younger then, several years into my service, assigned to a role that required a level of composure under pressure that I genuinely didn't know I had until the moment I was forced to find out. The details of the operation itself are still not something I can lay out piece by piece, not because I'm being coy for the sake of this story, but because some of it remains the kind of information that doesn't belong in a video, even one as personal as this. What I can tell you is that there was a night, during a deployment that was supposed to be routine, almost boring by the standards of the work, when something went wrong in a way that none of our planning had accounted for. Communication broke down. A small group of us ended up isolated in a situation that required decisions made in seconds. Decisions where being wrong meant people didn't come home. I was the one who ended up making several of those decisions. Not because I was the highest-ranking person there, but because I was the one who didn't freeze when freezing would have been the easiest and most human response. I still remember the exact texture of that night, the specific quality of silence that settles over a situation right before everything goes wrong. A silence that feels almost peaceful for half a second before your training kicks in and tells you that peaceful is the worst possible sign. I remember the sound of equipment failing, small mechanical sounds that meant something enormous in context. I remember looking around at the faces of people younger than me, people who'd trusted the plan the same way I had, watching that trust evaporate in real time as the plan stopped meaning anything at all. I remember, too, the strange detail your mind sometimes fixates on in moments like that. The smell of diesel and salt air, the particular angle of moonlight on metal, details that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the brain trying to anchor itself to something solid while everything else gave way. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives in moments like that, one I've never been able to fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived through something similar. Time doesn't slow down the way movies suggest. It narrows instead, cutting away everything except the next necessary decision, stripping away fear and doubt, and even, strangely, your own sense of self-preservation, until all that's left is a kind of mechanical focus on the next right action. I made several of those decisions that night, one after another, each one closing off a worse outcome and opening a narrower, harder path forward. And somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped being aware of being afraid at all, which I've since learned is its own kind of warning sign, one that took me years to fully understand. We made it through, all of us, though not without cost, and not without the kind of damage that doesn't show up on any after-action report because it isn't the kind of damage that bleeds. In the weeks after, there were debriefs, careful clinical conversations about what had gone wrong and what had been done right, conversations that reduced an entire night of held breath and narrowing time into bullet points on a page. Somewhere in one of those debriefs, someone described the way I'd operated that night, refusing every instinct to pull back, holding position when holding position made no logical sense. And the word that got used, half admiration and half disbelief, was the word that stuck. The nickname spread the way these things do in close units, quietly at first, said with a kind of careful respect, then more openly, until eventually it wasn't really a nickname anymore so much as a kind of shorthand, a way for people who hadn't been there to acknowledge they understood, at least in outline, what kind of night it had been. I never asked for it. I never particularly wanted it in those early months, because every time someone used it, I felt the weight of the night underneath the word, felt myself pulled back into that narrowed, mechanical clarity even standing in a mess hall eating reheated eggs. Eventually, the way most things do, it softened into something more ordinary, just a name people used. The way any nickname eventually loses its sharp edges and becomes simply part of how people refer to you. What almost nobody outside that small circle ever learned was what it cost afterward, in the months and years that followed, to carry a story like that quietly through an ordinary life. There were nights, long after I'd come home for good, when the narrowed clarity from that operation would surface uninvited, triggered by something as small as a car backfiring or a sudden silence in a crowded room, my body remembering a posture my mind had supposedly left behind. I learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to carry it without letting it announce itself, how to sit at dinners exactly like this one and let people believe the simplified version, the one where I'd served honorably and come home and settled into a quiet life, without ever needing to know the texture of what quiet had actually cost to build. My husband had been one of the only people who'd seen even a glimpse of what that cost looked like up close. The handful of times early in our relationship when the past surfaced without warning, when he'd had to learn, without any instruction manual, how to sit beside someone moving through something he couldn't fully see and couldn't fix. He never asked for the details either. He'd simply learned, the way people who love someone with a complicated history eventually learn, that some doors get opened on their own schedule, and that pushing on them only makes them harder to open at all. That patience was part of why, standing near our table that night while I disappeared toward the bar with a stranger, he hadn't worried, hadn't reached for his phone or shifted in his seat. He'd simply trusted that whatever was unfolding was mine to handle, and that I'd come back and tell him what he needed to know, in my own time, the same way I always had. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from carrying something significant that almost nobody around you has the context to understand. And I think that loneliness was part of why the uncle's reaction had hit me as hard as it did. For 3 years, I'd sat at tables like this one, surrounded by people who knew the outline of my service and nothing of its actual shape. And in a strange way, I'd made peace with that distance, had decided it was simply the cost of building a life among people who hadn't shared that particular chapter. And then, without warning, across a dinner table over wine neither of us had earned the taste for, that distance had collapsed entirely, replaced by a stranger who understood, immediately and completely, exactly what that one word had meant. The nickname came afterward, given half as a joke and half as genuine respect, the way nicknames in that world often work, born out of the specific way I'd handled myself when things fell apart. A description someone used in the after-action discussion that stuck because it was accurate in a way that felt almost uncomfortable to the people who'd been there. It wasn't about aggression. It was about refusing to back down from a situation that every instinct screamed to retreat from. About holding a line when holding it was the only thing standing between a bad night and a catastrophic one. The uncle, it turned out, had heard a version of that story years before he ever met me, passed along through the kind of informal network that exists among people who've served. Stories that travel sideways across units and decades, picking up detail and losing precision as they go. He hadn't known my name. He hadn't known my face. He'd known a nickname and a handful of facts about a night that had apparently become something close to a quiet legend in certain circles. The kind of story told carefully, respectfully, among people who understood exactly how close it had come to ending differently. He described it to me almost reverently, the way you'd describe a story you'd been told so many times it had taken on the texture of myth, even though somewhere underneath the myth was a real night, a real version of me, 20-something and terrified and refusing to let the fear show. He said the story had circulated in fragments, different versions emphasizing different details depending on who was telling it, some focusing on the tactical decisions, others on the sheer improbability that anyone had walked away from that situation at all. He'd never heard a name attached to it. In his version, I'd always been an idea more than a person, a cautionary tale and an inspiration folded into the same anonymous figure. What struck him most, he told me, standing there with the bar noise rising and falling around us, was how ordinary I seemed. Not in a diminishing way, he was careful to clarify, but in the sense that the version of the story he'd carried for years had calcified into something almost mythological, and meeting the actual person behind it, a woman drinking sparkling water at her sister-in-law's anniversary dinner, worrying about whether she'd remembered to feed the dog before they left the house, collapsed an enormous psychological distance in the space of about 4 minutes. He said it was disorienting in a way he hadn't expected, like meeting a historical figure and discovering they complained about traffic the same as everyone else. I asked him, gently, how he'd ended up hearing about it in the first place, given how many years and how much distance separated his service from mine. That's when the conversation shifted from interesting coincidence into something considerably heavier, something that would end up reaching directly into the family sitting 20 feet away from us, still picking at dessert menus, still entirely unaware that the quiet uncle at the end of the table was about to learn something that would change how he saw at least one of them for the rest of his life. Standing there at the bar, he told me something that genuinely caught me off guard, something that connected the third open loop I promised you back at the start of this video to something much larger than a single deployment. He told me that the reason the name had affected him so deeply wasn't just nostalgia or old soldier sentiment. It was because someone very close to him, someone in his own family, had been part of a related operation years later, an operation that had drawn directly on protocols and lessons that came out of the very incident that gave me my nickname in the first place. In other words, without ever meeting me, without ever knowing my name, a piece of what I'd survived had already reached into his family and potentially saved someone he loved. He hadn't put all of this together when he first heard the nickname across the dinner table, not consciously, not in that immediate flash of recognition, but standing there explaining it to me, working through the connection out loud almost as much for his own benefit as mine, I watched him realize in real time just how small and strange the world actually is. How a single moment of composure under fire years earlier could ripple outward into places you'd never expect to find it, including, apparently, a family dinner you almost didn't attend. We're getting close now to the part of this story where everything you've been holding on to finally clicks into place. But before we get there, I want to bring you back to that dinner table, because the rest of the family was about to learn far more than they bargained for when this whole evening started. When the uncle and I returned to the table, the energy had shifted in a way that was almost physical, the kind of shift you can feel before anyone says a word. My brother-in-law had clearly spent the last 20 minutes stewing, half embarrassed and half defensive, the way people get when they've been caught underestimating someone and haven't yet decided whether to admit it or double down. My sister-in-law looked relieved just to see us walking back, like she'd been holding her breath the entire time, terrified the evening had been permanently derailed. The rest of the table had clearly spent those 20 minutes speculating, in the low, careful way families do when something unusual happens, and nobody wants to be the one who asks the obvious question out loud. I caught fragments of it as we approached. Someone murmuring something about old war stories, someone else suggesting maybe they'd known each other before, theories built on nothing because nobody had any actual information to work from. Just the memory of a man's face draining of color over two ordinary-sounding words. The uncle didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood at the head of that section of the table and, in a voice that had none of the shakiness from earlier, told the assembled family a short, careful version of what he'd just learned, leaving out the classified specifics but making clear, in language even people who'd never served could understand, exactly what kind of person had been sitting quietly at their dinners for 3 years without a single one of them bothering to ask a real question. I watched my brother-in-law's face change as the uncle spoke, watched the smugness drain out of it the same way color had drained from the uncle's face earlier in the evening, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The silence said enough, and for the rest of the dinner, every time I caught his eye, he looked away first. The rest of the table reacted in the small, varied ways families do when confronted with information that reorganizes how they see someone. Some leaned forward, suddenly curious in a way that felt almost hungry, peppering me with questions I gently deflected. Others went quiet, recalculating every previous conversation we'd ever had, replaying old comments and jokes through a lens that made some of them land very differently in hindsight. My sister-in-law reached over at one point and squeezed my hand under the table, a small gesture that said more than any of her father's golf stories ever had. An acknowledgement, finally, that she'd been sitting across from someone whose life she'd never actually bothered to ask about. Through all of it, my sister-in-law's father stayed quiet, watching the uncle speak with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time, something between polite interest and a vague, unplaced familiarity. The look of a man hearing the edges of a story that almost rang a bell he couldn't yet locate. I didn't know it then, but he was less than an hour away from understanding exactly why that bell was ringing, and exactly how directly his own life connected to the woman sitting quietly at the other end of his daughter's anniversary dinner. But the most important part of this story, the part that closes the loop the uncle's reaction opened in the first place, isn't really about my brother-in-law's embarrassment. It's about what happened after dinner, in the parking lot, when the uncle pulled me aside one more time before everyone went their separate ways. He told me something I hadn't expected, something that ties directly back to that night years ago, the one that earned me the nickname in the first place. He told me that the family member of his who'd been part of that later, related operation, the one who'd benefited indirectly from the protocols built off what I'd survived, was actually someone sitting at that very dinner table, someone who'd been introduced to me earlier in the evening with nothing more than a first name and a polite handshake, someone whose connection to my own history neither of us had any reason to suspect until that exact night. He told me who it was, and when he did, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel walking into a routine family dinner, a kind of quiet, overwhelming recognition that the world really does fold back on itself in ways you rarely get to witness directly. It was my sister-in-law's own father, the soft-spoken man who'd spent most of the dinner talking about golf and grandchildren, who had been part of that operation, who owed a piece of his survival, however many steps removed, to a night I rarely talked about because I genuinely didn't think anyone needed to hear it. The uncle filled in the rest carefully, choosing his words the way people do when they're aware they're handing someone a piece of their own history they didn't know was missing. The operation his nephew by marriage, my sister-in-law's father, had been part of years later had drawn directly on a set of protocols developed in the aftermath of that night I'd lived through. Protocols built specifically because of the decisions made under pressure that earned me my nickname in the first place. It wasn't a poetic, abstract connection. It was procedural, documented, the kind of direct line that exists in training manuals and briefing rooms, long after the people who lived the original moment have moved on with their lives, never knowing exactly where the lessons ended up traveling. He explained that this sort of thing happens more often than anyone outside that world realizes, that a single night, a single set of decisions made by people whose names rarely surface publicly can quietly reshape how entire units operate for years afterward, can become the invisible scaffolding underneath someone else's survival in a completely different deployment, a completely different decade, without either party ever knowing the other exists. Most of the time, he said, the people who built that scaffolding never find out who walked across it safely because of them. Most of the time, the story simply ends in an after-action report, filed away, unread by anyone outside a small circle. The human cost and the human payoff forever separated by paperwork and protocol, and the simple, ordinary passage of time. He told me this with a kind of quiet wonder, like a man still working through the improbability of it even as he explained it to me, and I found myself thinking about how many other invisible threads like this one were probably running through that very dinner, through every dinner, unnoticed connections between strangers who'd never know how close their lives had actually come to intersecting long before a wedding or an anniversary brought them into the same room. It made the whole evening feel different, suddenly, less like a routine obligation and more like a small, accidental window into how much of life happens just beneath the surface of what people choose to share with each other. Standing there, processing the shape of what he was telling me, I found myself thinking about all the dinners before this one, all the holidays where my sister-in-law's father had sat across from me asking polite, surface-level questions about my service, never once suspecting, because how could he, that something forged in a night I rarely spoke about had quietly followed him home from his own deployment years later, and possibly kept him alive long enough to walk his daughter down the aisle, long enough to sit at this very table asking me, with no idea what he was really asking, how the chicken was. I'm not going to pretend that moment didn't change something in me. For years, I'd treated that nickname, and the night behind it, as something private, something that belonged in a part of my life I kept carefully separated from family dinners and small talk about vacation homes. Standing in that parking lot, hearing how directly the consequences of that night had reached into the very family I'd married into, made it impossible to keep treating it as a closed chapter. It was very much still open, still rippling outward in ways I was only beginning to understand. I drove home that night with my husband in a kind of comfortable, exhausted silence. The radio off, the city lights sliding past the windows, both of us processing in our own ways an evening that had started as a chore and ended as something neither of us would forget. He reached over at one point and took my hand, not asking anything, just letting me know he was there, the same patient presence he'd offered for 3 years. And I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who understood that some stories arrive on their own timeline, and that love, real love, simply makes room for that. Before we get to how the rest of that night played out, and how this whole experience changed the way that family treats me at every gathering since, I want to take a moment to genuinely thank you for sticking with this story all the way through its turns. Stories like this one only work because people are willing to sit with the uncertainty long enough to let the payoff actually land. And you've done that. If this video has been worth your time, the best way to support more stories like it is simple. Stay close, keep watching, and let the channel know you're here for it. That night, after the parking lot conversation, after the family had mostly dispersed into cars and quiet goodbyes, my sister-in-law's father approached me directly for the first time. No longer the polite, distant in-law making small talk about golf, but someone who clearly understood, now, exactly who he'd been sitting across from for 3 years of holidays. He didn't say much either in the end. Some moments don't need many words. He simply thanked me, quietly, in a way that felt far heavier than the casual gratitude people usually offer at dinners like that, and told me he'd like to actually get to know me, the real version, whenever I was ready to share it. The brother-in-law who'd started the whole thing with his smug little question never brought up my service again. Not as a joke, not as a jab, not even as genuine curiosity. Something about that night recalibrated whatever assumptions he'd been carrying about who I was and what I'd done. And while he never apologized directly to me, the shift in how he treated me afterwards said more than an apology would have anyway. The third open loop closes here, fully, because the uncle's reaction wasn't really about fear of me specifically. It was about the sudden, disorienting collapse of distance between a past he'd carried quietly for decades and a present he thought had nothing to do with it. The first loop closes too, because now you understand exactly why a stranger's face went pale over 2 simple words. 2 words that meant nothing to most of the people at that table, and meant everything to a man who'd spent years wondering whatever happened to the people connected to that story. And the second loop closes as well, because you now know the nickname wasn't a joke at all. It was a record of a night where composure mattered more than fear. A night whose consequences had quietly traveled further than I ever could have guessed, all the way into a dining room full of people who thought they already knew exactly who I was. What stays with me most, even now, isn't the uncle's reaction or my brother-in-law's embarrassment, though both of those moments mattered in their own way. What stays with me is the reminder that the people around us are almost always carrying more history than we give them credit for. That a quiet uncle at the edge of a dinner table might be holding decades of memory nobody ever bothered to ask about, and that the things we survive in silence have a way of reaching further into the lives of people we love than we ever expect them to. These days, that family treats me differently, not in some dramatic, constant way, but in small, consistent gestures that mean more than they might to an outsider. My sister-in-law's father asks real questions now, the kind that come from genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. And I've learned, slowly, that I don't have to give him every detail to give him something true. My brother-in-law still works in finance, still talks too much about golf, but he's never once tried to needle me again. And on the rare occasions our paths cross at family events, there's a respect between us now that wasn't there before. Earned the hard way, the way most real respect tends to be. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. Somewhere in your own life, there's probably someone sitting quietly at your table, at your gatherings, at your holidays, who's never been asked the real question, who's been reduced to small talk and assumptions because nobody thought to dig deeper. What would happen if you asked them genuinely what their story actually is? I'd love to know in the comments. Has something like this ever happened in your own family? A moment where one offhand question revealed something nobody at the table expected. Tell me about it below. I read every single one, and I promise you, some of the best stories I've ever heard started exactly the way this one did, with someone finally asking the question everyone else was too comfortable to ask.